welcome back. Welcome to the second episode of Heresy Hunting, which I'm sure quite a few people have been waiting for. And so for the second episode, we are going to be talking about growing up Duggar. Yep, I'm going for it. So yeah, first the introduction and kind of how this book even ended up on my shelf. So I think it had to have been either 2013 or 2014 when my mom told me and my sister about this Christian big family. That was a weird way of saying it. This big family that was Christian. And I think me at the time, I was fascinated by any place that had a bunch of kids living together. So like orphanages, boarding schools, camps, big families. That was all very fascinating to me. I guess me at the time, I just liked the idea of living with a bunch of kids. Not sure how many other kids felt like that. So yeah, there was that. So we watched the shows and we read this book at the time, or at least a good amount of it at the time. And then over the years, I feel like I kind of started to drift away from the show. I mean, it started with there was from what I saw, there were a lot of births on the show, and with how often I kept seeing them, I got to the point where it's like I couldn't stand to watch them. So when my mom and my sister would keep watching the show and there was a birth scene that came up, I would like leave the room, or like if there were other times where there was one time where in grade 9 science class we were doing a unit about pregnancy and stuff, and it showed this animation where this birth sequence, and I had to like cover my eyes and ears, and I remember some of the kids around me would say, well, your mom went through that for you. And I don't remember what I said to that at the time, but I remember thinking afterwards, like, you don't understand what I've been through. So yeah, there's that. And then I think even after that there was I developed a general disinterest in the show. And then after that, I started to see kind of the perception of the show and this family, especially with what Josh did, which we'll get into a little bit later. And then of course there's a conversation about on the internet about like child exploitation, and that was mainly talking about family vlogging channels, but I guess the same thing could be said about this show. And yeah, and then of course the most recent thing was Jill and Ginger coming out about distancing themselves from some of the beliefs that they grew up with. Yeah. So on that last point, I know in going through this book, I know that the women who wrote this book may not agree with everything in this book anymore, but I'm still going to talk about these ideas. So there's that. And I also, you can kind of see here, I have a lot of tabs on this book, mainly orange tabs. And the orange tabs, I originally set it up for things I wanted to investigate, but now, well, through reading this book, I kind of just used it as a way to just flag things. So yeah, but obviously I'm not going to get to all these tabs, so I had to narrow down what I really wanted to talk about. And I also realized while I was planning this that this is why I skipped talking about what this series is about. I may not back up what I'm about to say as biblically as I did in the first heresy hunting videos, but yeah, I tried in some cases, and I hope you'll still listen. So the last thing I want to say is that this was kind of a hard book to get through. For one, it was hard for me to actually start reading it, because I guess I kind of thought, oh, if I remember, this is going to be sugary sweet, and I don't know if I can deal with that right now. And then while I was reading it, it was hard to get through. Like, I usually only get through like one chapter a day, and there were some days when I didn't read because I guess it's holiday season and busyness and stuff. And I actually meant to finish this like a few days before filming this video so that I had time to really think through what I was going to say, but I ended up finishing this just yesterday. So yeah, but hopefully this will still be a worthy, I don't know. Let's get into it. So starting off, I wanted to talk about some of the good things in this book. So I wrote down a few specific things. So the first thing that I realized about this book that I was like, oh, I guess that is actually good, is the talk about like loving your enemies. That was something I was really passionate about when I was younger, especially in middle school. And I feel like as I've gotten older, that's kind of drifted away. So it was good to be reminded of that. And another thing I appreciated is that I can't remember exactly which chapter this was set in, but they acknowledged that we are all born with a sin nature. In the rise of culture, saying that people are basically good. It was refreshing to even some Christians saying that. It was good to see, acknowledge that we do have sin nature. And this is hard to sum up in a short thing, but another thing that I noticed that I liked was that talking about how you have to be worthy of the person you want. And what I mean by that is I think at this time and a little and while I was growing up is really emphasized to young women that they should look for a guy with good character. But what they often don't talk about is that the girls they are talking to may or may not have good character themselves. So kind of the idea that if you want a man of God, you have to be a woman of God and all that kind of stuff, which I know in our culture people don't like that message as much, and the popular saying now is oh, if you don't love me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best, which I don't entirely disagree with that, but you also, I don't know, you have to work on yourself as well. So yeah, there's that. And another specific thing was that talking about how serving others is a primary focus as Christians. Now I might push back a little bit in that maybe it shouldn't be our primary focus. Our primary focus should be to glorify God, but I guess that's often done through serving others. So yeah, there's that. And I will say a lot of the general ideas in this book are good, but it's just that they come alongside these statements and beliefs that are a bit questionable. So we will get into that starting now. So the first thing I wanted to briefly talk about was this is in the second chapter, and it's talking about this obedience game. So basically it's this game meant to kind of teach kids to obey and to yeah, it's I don't know much else to say right now. So they talk about this game, but then at the end of talking about this game, oh wait, this is more about character qualities. I thought this game, so I have to make a correction on the fly. I thought this game came from Institute and Basic Light Principles, but this is just, they're talking about here is just a list of character qualities. So my point is kind of a little bit shipwrecked. So basically what I wanted to point out is that there is throughout the book mentions of these different Gothard programs. So mentions Institute of Basic Life Principles, Embassy Institute, ACI, is that how it goes? Those kinds of things are all mentioned. And in the last chapter, when they're talking about ministries they're involved with, Jana talks about this retreat that is the Gothard program. So yeah. And to say, I thought this game originally was, which maybe still is, but to say that these ideas and this retreat is inherently bad because it was associated with this Gothard thing, I guess would be committing the genetic fallacy. But it still kind of goes to show that they are subtly promoting that in this book. So, and then we're going to be moving on to the fifth chapter, which is about guys. And here they talk about idolatry, and they define idolatry as this: an extreme admiration, love, or reverence for something or someone. I don't like that definition because in the Bible, idolatry was the literal worship of false god. Yeah, and I know they're saying it's a different dictionary definition, but I feel like defining idolatry as just liking something a lot can be a little bit problematic because it can cause people to not pursue passions or things that could actually bring a lot of glory to God because they're worried they'll like it too much, or they'll suppress good desires because what if that becomes an idol? And I mean, think about this. This is kind of a reference to a post I saw about idolatry. But Hannah from First Samuel, was she committing idolatry when she cried out to God for a son or for a child? Well, God didn't seem to think so. So there's that. Also, in this same chapter, I'm not going to reference the exact page, but they give the whole romance novels give women unrealistic expectations little talk. So yeah, and I'm not saying this is not flown in as well. Now, that certainly is true in some cases, but I feel like that whole line of romance novels give women unrealistic expectations can be used to dismiss expectations that are actually reasonable. Like, so there was this Instagram post that I saw that went more in depth into this, and I'm not gonna retell the whole thing, but I will tell you how it started. Is it started? Romance novels give women unrealistic expectations, and the expectation is being loved and cherished. So, and let me take a moment to talk about my expectations that I apparently got from romance novels. My apparently unrealistic expectations was to actually love and be attracted to the person that I'm with. Or not even necessarily that I would still feel what I felt before we got together while we were in a relationship. Apparently, that's an unrealistic expectation that I apparently got from romance novels. Maybe the problem isn't romance novels, but rather us telling women that their expectations should be too low. Just something to think about. And then in the last part of this 5th chapter about guides, they have a little section where it's like, I guess not really an interview, but kind of just a conversation and talk between Josh and Anna. And this is definitely the part of the book that is aged the worst. Because, like, I'm sure we all know things that Josh has did or was apparently accused of. And I'm not here to say that whether things that have been said about him are true or not. But what I am here to say is that because 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 of what he has admitted to and the stuff he's been accused of, whether or not the new stuff is true, his public image is forever tainted. And he'll forever be seen as a bad man, and Anna will forever be seen as someone who will stick by her husband even if he's really bad. And whether or not those labels are true for them, that is how they forever see them. So when people read this book, and obviously this book came out before all that stuff was public, even if some of the stuff they say is good, people are going to automatically dismiss it just because of Josh's reputation. So, yeah. Then we get to the next chapter in the book is about relationship with culture, and this is mainly talking about media. And so they talk, and I'm just going to read this quote from this part. One specific thing that our parents have always been careful about is magic, which often shows up in children's movies. As harmless as it may seem, it's not a joke in God's eyes. Magic, sorcery, witches, spellcasting, and the like are all part of a demonic realm that God wants us to stay away from. No matter how good a film containing magic may seem, God speaks seriously about this throughout the Bible. It's not something to be glorified or portrayed by any means as something fun or attractive. So, that was actually the whole reason why I wanted to do this video. Because I remember reading that when I was younger, and I even, wrote it in my diary as, older self, please remember this. But now that I've gotten older, I have a bit of a different perspective on this. And I already know lots of Christians are going to disagree with me, and that's fine, but I hope that you'll at least hear me out, okay? And if you think I'm wrong, just pray for me. So when it comes to magic in kids' movies, if they're glorifying actual witchcraft, that's one thing. I don't know much about actual witchcraft, but, if they're glorifying, spells that involve blood or real spiritual practices like tarot cards or astrology or stuff like that. If they're glorifying actual practices, that's one thing. But a lot of the kids' movies, especially at this time, it's not real. It's not real witchcraft. If you were to try it in real life, it wouldn't work. I know a lot of parents get up in arms about Harry Potter, but that's not real witchcraft. Also, I should say, because I feel like a lot of Christians don't understand this, just because something is in a story doesn't automatically mean that it's portrayed as a good thing. People have been seen Christians say about The Little Mermaid or the book The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue of like, oh, there's literally a deal with the devil in this. And now I can't speak for Invisible Life of Addie LaRue because I haven't read that book and I don't plan on reading that book. But for The Little Mermaid, I have to say, like, if you've watched the movie, you would know that the devil that Ariel makes the deal with is literally the villain. So, I just wanted to say that. Now, as I was starting to say earlier, now some parents discount ban Harry Potter because they feel like it normalizes witchcraft, which, like, if that's your conviction, then you should stick with that. But you can also, if that's your concern, you can also, like, say to your kids, like, hey, this magic in this movie, this isn't real, or hey, this movie is gonna have magic, but like we don't personally support that. Like that's basically what my parents did, and so like I watched movies with magic growing up. I sometimes played and pretended to have magical powers. I even played Harry Potter with my cousin once, like a Harry Potter like game. And guess what? Never tempted to do witchcraft, nor never thought that witchcraft was a good thing. So, and I understand that's not true for every kid, but it could certainly be true for a lot of kids. Now, I feel like this Christian parents being against magic in movies, it can also come from not necessarily people like it's not just coming from like I guess legalistic sources, and I guess where it's coming from, and I guess you could argue this is also legalistic. With social media, there's been the rise in the Christian community, people who built followings because they are an ex-witch, an ex-New Ager, an ex-Satanist, etc. So, and they've often talked about like the magic in movies or like secret things in movies. Oh, and also that you shouldn't celebrate Halloween. Now, of course, the Halloween conversation is a whole other thing, and I think there's also a conversation to be had about how ex witches, ex New Agers, ex whatevers tend to rely more on their past experiences rather than the Word of God. But we don't have time to get into that today. What I do want to say about the parent who's, or to the person who's saying, well, I shouldn't watch movies with magic because an ex-witch said so. What I want to say to that is, of course, an ex-witch is going to have strong convictions about magic in movies. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong for every Christian to do that. Like, first, like I will say, like, I think by nature, like, prone to black and white thinking. It kind of makes more sense to me. But I understand now that when it comes to convictions, that the same thing can affect people differently, and our brains all work in different ways. So now it kind of makes sense to me why something can be wrong for one person to do because God convicted them of it, but not be wrong for someone else to do. And I was going to get into that a bit more, so I just want to understand that. And also, if the magic in movies is a no-go, then does that mean movies like Narnia and Lord of the Rings aren't allowed? Stories that were written by Christian men, and in the case of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is literally a biblical allegory for the gospel? Now, not to say that there aren't problems with those things, but to just dismiss them just because they use the word magic in them, that seems like a bit much. Now, again, if you're convicted, then avoid it, but you don't have to push that on every Christian. And I understand that in the context of this is talking about kids media, and I understand that parents, like, especially in this time, vetting the media before your kids see it, it's pretty much a necessity. But considering the kids media landscape of today, fantasy made up magic should be the least of your concerns with media today. So yeah, that was a whole thing. So yeah, again, if you think I'm wrong, pray for me. So yeah. Alright, now shortly after that part is when they talk about music. And there's a whole thing here talking about rock and roll and how it glorifies all these things. But then they also talk about some things and they say, like, even if we were to make it Christian, it would still be bad. Now, I remember reading that and kind of wondering, is this a Bill Gothard thing? Because I remember I'd heard that, like, he had taught that, like, drums are inherently demonic. So I looked it up and I found a quote from, I think this is someone who left Gothardism. And so this is what they said. There were, however, a few principles that were non-negotiable at our house. One of them was the stance against rock music. This meant that any secular or Christian music that had a backbeat or or heavy beat. Mr. Gothard teaches that this type of music, regardless of the lyrics or the spirit of the music, is evil and invites participation from the enemy, Satan. I remember examples of how the drums in other cultures were used to invite evil spirits. The logical conclusion that this was evidence of the sin and demonic activity of such music. So I was like, my suspicions were right. And actually, I didn't even notice until after I read this quote and I read it again. They actually mentioned backbeat in this. So again, like I said in my Christian music video, where does it say that songs, hymns, and spiritual songs should not sound a certain way? And also, they talk about rock music and they say these words are sung in a breathy and sensual voice. And I mean, this may not be everyone's experience, but like from the rock music I've heard in both secular and Christian music, I never really thought of the vocals as sensual, so I don't know where. Maybe I just listened to maybe not listening to the right music, but and with breathy, like, is breathy always a bad thing? I mean, I understand maybe in some contexts how it could be, but like if breathy is inherently a bad thing, then a lot of Christian women's conference speakers should be out. Okay, that was more of a joke, and I meant to insert a clip of Lacey Abercrombie making fun of that kind of voice, but I actually haven't seen that voice used in a lot of things, so that was more of a, I don't know how true that is, but still, come on. And also, another thing I want to say, and this doesn't necessarily prove me right, but I just feel like it needs to be said. John Cooper of the band Skillet, the band has always been seen as kind of edgy, and recently had people pearl clutching over their rendition of O Come, Come Emmanuel. I have to say that John has remained more faithful to Jesus than many of the other Christian artists coming from safer genres. Although I think, based on what I've read, even like pop music would not be allowed in Gothardism. So, okay, the last thing, and I don't have as much to say as I did on the last two things, but they did kind of talk about briefly about growing up with cameras in their face. And they said, oh, these camera people aren't around all the time, and they're like family to us. They have been there for all these different experiences and like all those things. So I guess what I want to say to that is that yes, while these people might feel like family, this is still exploitation. They're still filming your private moments for all the world to see. So yeah, I don't have much else to say on that. And again, and this is just from the perspective of the four oldest girls. Have we heard how the rest of the kids feel? Like as someone kind of briefly pointed out in another video, like I think it's kind of impossible that with a family of this size, all 19 kids will consent to being filmed. So yeah. Alright, so for this last little part before my conclusion, I just wanted to talk about a few minor things that I noticed that I don't have that much to say on. So, for one, on page 60, they use the term undeserved kindness, which may not be a wrong term, but that is a Jehovah's Witness term. So, maybe they didn't know that, but yeah. And then on page 191, they use the term radically saved. And I know this is maybe a somewhat common term, but I'm not really a fan of that because it implies like is there now levels to being saved? Like is there somewhat saved, normal saved, major saved, radically saved, over saved? Like you're either saved or you're not. There's not like sure some people may be more passionate about their salvation than others, but that doesn't mean they're any more or less saved. So yeah. And then towards the end of the book, they say something along the lines of that God desires us to have a dynamic and abundant life. I'm just curious what they mean by abundant life, because it sounds like we're leaning into prosperity gospel kind of things. So, in conclusion about this book, there are some right things in this book, as I've said, but the Gothard influence and other questionable ideas it kind of takes, I don't know if it takes away from that, but it's still there. It's still something you should read with caution, I guess. So, after all that, I'm very curious to read Ginger's book, which I will read like late this year. I read the description and it seems like I've gotten a taste of what she might address in this book, but I'm curious to see how much of this she'll address and because her whole thing is that she's disentangled, so she's like kind of worked through things she believes and like keeping the core of the gospel, but like leaving behind some not biblical ideas. So I'm curious to know what she'll address. That is the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it, even despite some maybe controversial opinions. But I hope this gave you something to think about. So that is all. Goodbye.